This is Rumpuentutura. What I would like to talk about today is educational gaming from a designer's perspective. Now, there are two reasons that I want to look at this. The first one is, even if you're not planning to design any educational games, even if you're just planning to use either games designed specifically for education or commercial games, you still benefit from knowing how a designer thinks about games. It gives you greater insight into how the game works. It gives you a greater insight into how a designer thinks and why some decisions that might have been opaque to you, like saying, well, I don't understand why that level in Myst is constructed that way, suddenly become clear. And having that greater understanding helps you make better decisions about how to use that game in the classroom. There's a second reason for this, and that is that by now I'm hoping that at least some of you will have decided that, well, there are some nice educational games out there, and there are some nice commercial games I can use in education, but I'd like to maybe try my hand at designing a game for use in my classroom, or at the very least a mini game that could maybe supplement one of these other games. And I would like to encourage you to think along those lines, and obviously if that's the way your thoughts are trending, well, this will be some very useful information for you to have. So let's get started. In starting out, one of the first things that you need to think about is who is going to be putting together this project. And the team that's usually involved in design decisions will look something like this. Now, at this point, if you are thinking of designing a game, you might say, whoa, that's way too many people. I'll never get that team together. But you can think of it instead as functions that will need to be covered by somebody to make the game. Now, that somebody could be the same person for all of these functions, or it could be a much smaller team than what seems to be implied by this, where, say, one person takes care of design, education, and programming, and the second person takes care of all of the aspects that have to do with visual, sound, etc. So you shouldn't view this as something to scare you off, but rather something that you want to keep in mind as you're looking at a game in terms of what's involved in making it. And running through the team very briefly, you have the game designer. That's the person that has the overall big picture concept for the game, as well as the more local issues of how the game should be designed, what the challenges should be, how they should be implemented. Then you have content and learning specialists in education that connect the game to what you want to achieve in the classroom. A production manager that makes sure everybody is staying on top of their tasks and one portion of the team isn't getting so far ahead of the others that suddenly you're going to have problems making deadlines or getting the whole game to fit together in the first place. A visual team, obviously this only applies to games that have a visual component, but other than interactive text adventures, most games do. And that will cover both a graphic artist as well as a 3D artist. And you shouldn't assume that these are one and the same. In fact, you tend to have one person that will do concept paintings, designs, etc. And then if your game uses 3D, a different person will generally be the one to implement them into 3D. Again, this may be done by the same person, but you'd be surprised how frequently it's not. Sound, and here again you have two different people who may be the same person, maybe not. One which composes soundtracks for the environment in the sense of saying, here's some music that will play along. Here's what the environment, say in the cave for Zelda, is going to sound like in terms of the music that accompanies it. But at the same time you have a second person who's going to design the soundscapes for the game. This covers things from rustling of grass to the sound the character's sword makes when it hits a rock, to general murmurs in the ambient that overall contribute to making a game a place where things occur and not just a musical soundstage. Next, you have people who will take care of narrative. And here you have somebody who will write the overall story and somebody who will translate that story into an actual script to be embedded and instantiated within the events of the game. Programmers who will take care of both the engine that underlies the game, in other words, the engine that says, well, for instance, when a character jumps in this game, how does the character fall back down, or when two objects collide, how do they react, as well as a different, potentially, group of programmers who will say, well, now that we have how when two objects collide, what happens to them, let's figure out when Mario collides with a mushroom, what should happen in gameplay and make that happen in terms of programming code. And finally, very important, don't forget this group, you have playtesters. And this is absolutely crucial because in general, if you have a game that goes out that's only been tested by the development team, odds are very, very good that things that were very obvious to the development team will not be obvious to the general population, and hence your game will flop, not because necessarily it was a badly designed or conceived game, but because the actual implementation failed to take into account how to make all the different aspects of the game visible and relevant to game players. So playtesters are an essential key component of this team. Okay, so you've got this team together, where it be one person or multiple people. What do you do next? Well, next you have to make some decisions. What's the game about? What's the topic of the game? Okay, and this isn't just, well, what area am I using it to support in education? There's going to be a story to this game. What is it about? What are going to be the key elements of gameplay? And this ranges from the very obvious. Am I typing in text to explore a scenario, or am I doing a rhythm game where I'm tapping in rhythm to the music? It can also go to very subtle aspects of gameplay, such as, will you be driving the course of the game forward due to a very hurried clock, or are you going to give players a very relaxed clock, maybe no clock at all, just take as much time as you need for decisions? What games in its genre will it resemble? It's possible that you're creating a game unlike any other game that has come before it, but the odds of that are not great. So which games does it resemble? And why? And which games will it be different from? And why? And what other games will it draw upon? In other words, if you're making a platformer and your character bears a suspicious resemblance to an Italian plumber by the name of Mario, well, not only is that going to tell you something about the mechanics, but it's also going to tell you something about the expectations that people will bring to the game. And those expectations will draw upon their expectations of Mario. So how are you going to use those elements that it's drawing upon? What are those games it's drawing upon, and why? What elements will be completely new to it? If all you're doing is copying Mario, people are going to say you're just copying Mario. Never mind that probably just copying Mario would not be terribly useful in a classroom. So what's going to be new about it? Why would people play that instead of playing Mario? Once you've done all of this, you may find that, well, now I need to rethink what the key elements of gameplay are. Like many of these questionnaires I've given you before, this is not intended to be a just go once through and you're done. It's intended to create a loop that you go through and say how you refine your thinking about the game as you go through the loop, and as you realize that some decisions may conflict with other decisions that you thought you were making, and you need to resolve that in a final game design. Once you've done that, you'll go back to what's the narrative outline. So there's a story here. How does that narrative outline fit with everything else you're talking about before it? And finally go back to your very first question. What's the game about? And maybe you're all set. You'll have the same answer as when you started. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find, that's changed. And you have to go through this decision loop once more. Okay. So this is all directly related to how you begin your design process. You've answered all of this. You've got your team together. Now I'm going to show you one of many approaches. There are many approaches to developing games, but I'm going to show you one approach that I found is particularly useful for people who are not necessarily full-time developers. So this approach is particularly useful for somebody like yourself who might be an educator who's dipping their toe in the water, either because they're going to use a game but want to better understand what's going on in the designer's mind, or they're going to work with somebody else to create a game, or you're going to be creating a game all by yourself. And the approach that I'm going to show you is based very largely upon something known as design patterns. What are design patterns? Well, design patterns were developed by Alexander, who's an architect, to deal with a very interesting question in architecture. Alexander is saying, well, I want to have people talk about buildings, and in particular, I want to have not just architects talking with other architects about buildings, but also have architects talking with the people who are going to be living in those buildings, using those buildings in productive ways, in ways that don't either involve talking down to somebody or marginalizing them from the design process or exposing them to tons of jargon that's completely meaningless to them. So Alexander and his team proposed is the design patterns approach, which says, well, look, features of buildings are answers to questions. They're answers to practical questions. They're answers to problems that people pose. Problems that say things like, well, how do you get into a building? How do you get from one floor to another? Each pattern, the elements, the tokens that people and architects are using to talk to each other comprise the following. The name of the pattern, a picture that illustrates what you're talking about, a paragraph that puts the pattern in the context of other patterns. There isn't just one pattern on its own, it's always set within the grouping of other patterns. A summary of the problem that the pattern is supposed to address, developing thinking through the problem, coming up with a solution to the problem and explaining, well, what's involved in terms of physics. In other words, well, what needs to stand on top of what so it doesn't topple over, but also social aspects. So how do people interact with these types of objects involved in the solution to a problem? A diagram that aids in visualizing the solution, and finally a final paragraph that says, well, this pattern is connected with these other patterns. Okay? So again, this is all something very abstract. We're going to look at an example in just a second, but I want to emphasize that the approach is oriented towards people taking control of the architecture of the spaces in which they live by developing an awareness of what's going on, in other words, of the pattern languages that comprise the elements involved in that architecture in which they are involved, that they live in, that they have a right to shape. Okay. So this is a complete example here. We have here first the name of the pattern. All patterns are numbered, so this one is pattern number 102, and it's called Family of Entrances. And here's a picture. You say, I get what is meant by the pattern that's labeled Family of Entrances. Then there's an introduction, and the introduction says, well, this pattern is an embellishment of circulation realms, and it goes on to talk a little bit more about what's involved in the circulation realms pattern, which involves collections of doorways, openings, entrance into different realms in a building. Okay, fine. Then what's this problem that we're going to be addressing? It's summarized here saying, well, when a person arrives in a complex of offices or services or workshops or in a group of related houses, there's a good chance he will experience confusion unless the whole collection is laid out before him so that he can see the entrance of the place where he is going. Okay, very clear. That's the problem to be addressed. Okay, then the development says, all right, so how is this pattern problem played out in different scenarios? And it goes through several different scenarios, and then it says, okay, now we have a solution to the problem. And the solution is stated as clearly and directly as the original problem. And it says, okay, lay out the entrances to form a family. This means, 1, they form a group, are visible together, and each is visible from all the others. 2, they're all broadly similar, for instance, all porches or all gates in a wall, or all marked by a similar kind of doorway. Very clear, very direct, and here's a diagram to finish clarifying the solution to the problem. Fine. Now the last thing is, as we had already mentioned in the introduction, there are connections to other patterns, and in that particular case we are just connecting it to circulation realms. But the connections section says, well, here are all these other patterns that it's connected to, and it lists main entrance, entrance transition, etc. In other words, Solving this problem is also intricately intertwined with solving these other problems, and each of these then constitutes a design pattern that is connected to the other design patterns. So overall what we have is a design pattern language that we can use to communicate about architecture. Wonderful. Okay, but we were making games, not building houses. So how is this connected to making games? Well, Björk and Holopainen have adapted the design pattern approach to making games, and they have a template for creating design patterns for games that will look very much like the template for architecture. There are 6 major components to their design pattern template, of which we'll only actually be using 3, namely the name, the description, and the relations with other design patterns. So as to make this concrete, let's look at an actual example. This example is taken from the Gameplay Design Patterns website. You'll find the reference to that at the end of this podcast. And here we're looking at the patterns involved in the game Pac-Man. Okay, so we have a range of patterns. We have collecting, collection, consumers, etc. We look at the first one, which is collecting, and it says the main actions performed in Pac-Man is moving and collecting pills. Okay, wonderful. Let's look at that in greater detail. And here is the collecting design pattern. And it's summarized as the action of collecting game elements from the game world. And now we have the more detailed description, which says that collecting is one of the most common activities in games. The collecting may be concrete by moving game elements around the game world and picking up game elements found, or may be abstract by receiving game elements directly through actions or completing goals. Okay, that tells us what this pattern is used for. Now we have a couple of examples from different games. And finally we have the relations to other patterns. So it tells us what other patterns instantiate collecting. So for instance, we know that score instantiates collecting, as does pickups. Okay. We also know that collecting in its turn instantiates other patterns. So it instantiates, among others, hierarchy of goals, movement, etc. There are patterns that it is modulated by, and there are patterns that it modulates. And we don't see any patterns that would be in conflict with here, but that could happen for some other design patterns. So that's what a design pattern for video games looks like. How would you go about using this in practice? Well, the first thing you would do is you would go to those design decisions you made at the beginning and say, okay, what games does my game most resemble? And you'd find those games in the list of games on the website. And then you would look at the design patterns associated with those games. And on each design pattern page, you'd look at both the definition and explanation for each design pattern. Look at some of the other examples, and this is where you might take a side detour to YouTube to look at videos of some of the other games if you don't know them. And then you would go to the right-hand side of the page, and you would click on the other patterns that are connected to the pattern you're studying and see what you find out about them and learn how all these connections play with each other to make the game you see. Now, like any language, it takes a while to learn the design pattern language. So you'll find yourself at the outset doing a lot of consulting and going back and forth. After a while, the elements will become more familiar to you, and eventually they'll become second nature. So after a while, you won't have to go in and look up, say, what hierarchy of goals looks like or what other patterns are connected to it. You'll know what they are, and you'll apply that in your game design automatically. What this will ultimately allow you to do is to keep track of all the elements that have to be in your game, and also know what other elements have to be connected to them, how they have to be connected to them, and do so efficiently and quickly. So now that we have this on hand, what does the overall process look like? First, you want to frame your existing material in terms of similar games and their design patterns. So you take those initial decisions that we talked about at the very beginning of this podcast, and you combine them with your newfound knowledge of design patterns to frame the material. Next, you want to develop the actual narrative structure. So develop the full-fledged narrative behind your game, and make sure to include all key plot, character, and event items at this point. Now you're not just talking about the general, what does the story look like, you really want to flesh it out. Next, you want to develop your game world structure, and here you have to remember two things. First, you can use the design patterns for both inspiration but also control of your game structure, and second, keep matching it back to the narrative structure. It's very easy to come up with an idea that says, oh, this would be great to add to the game, and then you realize if you go too far along with it that it actually contradicts what your narrative structure should look like at this point in the game. And finally, you want to match both narrative and game world to your educational goals as you go through the process. So that's the overall outline for the process. But there are a couple more things that you'll also find handy. The first one is a set of worksheets that have been created by Rawlings and Adams. And you'll find these worksheets in their book, Rawlings and Adams on Game Design. You'll also find them in the newer edition of that book, which is called Fundamentals of Game Design. Both editions of the book are excellent. It's a little cheaper, however, to find used copies of the older one. And these design worksheets are found at the end of each chapter. You don't need to read the chapter to get most out of the worksheets, but sometimes it can be quite useful. Some of the chapters deal with questions of general design, like the one I have here as an example, which is on gameplay. Some other chapters deal with more specific questions related to, say, the genre of a particular game. What the questions included in the worksheets are designed to do is to get you to think about this particular aspect of the game in ways you might not have done before. So, for instance, here for the gameplay worksheet, the first question is, what types of challenges do you want to include in your game? Do you want to challenge the player's physical abilities, his mental abilities, or both? Okay, that seems fairly straightforward. But run down to question number 6. And number 6 is the game's collection of challenges a related group, or is it a compilation of unrelated elements? And if the latter, does that have any effect on the player's suspension of disbelief? Now that's a very good question, and one that you might not have thought of when you were outlining gameplay, particularly gameplay in light of your narrative requirements. The second item you'll find handy, in fact I would argue very nearly essential, is to put all your decisions about the game as well as your analysis, etc., within 2 game design documents. And here once again I'm following a pattern suggested by Rawlings and Adams. And Rawlings and Adams suggest that you create 2 game design documents. These are pretty standard for the game industry, but even if you're not planning to sell your game, they're very important. The first one is the high concept statement. And the high concept statement is the statement you write when you want to say, well, what's the game about? And I want to explain all the key aspects to somebody succinctly and quickly. So I've got 5 minutes to make my pitch to someone. Well, how do I explain my game? And the other design document is the design script. And the design script is the one you actually use for the development of the game, for coordinating the team, and also keeping track of where everything is at every point in time. The high concept statement needs to have the core essentials in a very clear and compact form. So it needs to have the central idea of the game, the genre, the key features of the game, okay, so both the world and narrative, but also here make sure to clarify things with all appropriate diagrams, etc. You need to have your design goals in mind, and this should include your educational goals. You need to target your audience very clearly. What does your player look like? And finally, what are the unique features of the game? Those things that we described before that made sure that people will be playing it rather than Mario. Okay, so that's the high concept statement. The design script incorporates all of this, so you don't throw away that work. That's the beginning of the design script. But in addition to that, it includes the complete narrative script you developed before with all that atomic information. Remember, we said that was important to have that. Include the complete game world spec, and this has to connect things to the design patterns and make the narrative interactions very clear. You want to include, as you go along, design sketches and screenshots and the timelines for development. And notice that this is not a static document. It is designed to be updated. You want to think about this almost as though it were a 3-ring binder that you keep adding pages to, ripping pages out, or at least crossing them out and making notes in the margin when no longer applicable, etc. Obviously, these days you wouldn't keep it as a 3-ring binder, you'll keep it as a document on your computer, but it's very important that you view it as an in-process document, a document that guides your development process, but that in turn is modified by the process it is guiding. Okay, so with all of this, you now have enough to begin the process of designing a game if you're making one, or at the very least analyzing a game from the perspective of a game designer. As always, here are the resources I've cited in this podcast. As usual, I would like to propose a small exercise here. What I would suggest is that you pick a game you like. It could be one of the games that we've looked at before, or any other game that you know either from personal experience or looking at the videos on YouTube, and apply the design patterns process that we've talked about here to the game. In other words, find other games that it resembles, look at their design patterns, and then think about how those design patterns are implemented in the particular game of your choice and what that tells you about that game. In the next podcast, we're going to look at an example of how you would actually build a particular type of game. In this case, we'll see it's an action game using a simple toolset. Until next time, look for patterns in games, and of course, keep playing.